So I want to welcome you to a conversation that we're hosting here with Pastor Church Resources and the Christian Reformed Church. What we're trying to get at is there seems to be a dimension that needs to be explored by pastors and congregations that I think probably a lot of us are tempted to move past or avoid in this season of COVID and Black Lives Matter, and that's grief work. And so I have invited Marc Nelesen. He's a pastor, he's also a PhD, and one of his passions in his ministry and also in his study is helping congregations and other pastors access that grief work that we're tempted to neglect. And so I'm so grateful that you can be with us today, Dr. Nelesen. The question I want to start with is I'm really trying to get at what does good grief work look like for a pastor? And I don't presume it's all one size fits all, but it occurred to me, there's all this protesting happening as we record this. And I know that's really polarizing activity right now, but I wonder if there might be something that the protesters are kind of getting right that pastors maybe could learn from, if there's an insight there for us.
Yeah, that's a good way in. Well, what I think has happened is the world that we have come to experience the last 2 to 3 months with COVID-19 and all that is happening across our country right now, across the U.S. right now, is it is exposing things that we may have known were there, but we've denied, that we have been uncomfortable with. And I think depending on how we speak of what's taking place across the nation right now, I think there are different demonstrations and expressions that are trying to articulate pain. Pain that is not articulated is going to come out sideways. It's going to come out in violence. It's going to come out in health issues. It's going to come out in social ills. And I often think about the energy it takes to hold down a beach ball underwater. We get tired, we get weary of it, and eventually something comes out sideways. And I think one of the things that we've long been denying is we believe, I think we've believed as people of the United States, that we are somehow immune from the stuff that the rest of the world faces, whether that's terrorism or scarcity or disease or social problems. And unfortunately, in the last number of weeks and months, these things have come out full storm. And I don't think we know yet what to do with that. And so we find ourselves in the midst of a time in which we are still trying to figure out what all of this means. And in order to get there, I think we have to trace the pain. We have to look at our sense of yearning for what was, and I think we have to pay attention to that. I think we have to pay attention to the pain in our country and the pain in our body life and things that we just didn't look at before, or we didn't see, or if we did see or did look at them, we didn't know how deep the wound was. And that takes profound courage, and I think it takes profound vulnerability to sort of stop ourselves, to check ourselves, and ask ourselves, what's going on? And as my colleague and friend, Dr. Gibson, recently said, this more than ever is a time, I think, for pastors in particular to take the time that's needed to sort out what's happening inside of us. I had a pastoral interaction about 2 months ago, does not relate to anything we are talking about directly, But this parishioner shares this story with permission. Was minding her grandchild on the piano, and she turned this way, and the 18-month-old went this way, and gashed open his head, and lots of tears, lots of crying, and husband came home and said, "Yeah, we probably should address that," and got the child stitched up, and this parishioner was sharing this with me, and I was trying to be helpful as a pastor. "Oh, I'm sure your children will trust you again with your grandchild. Isn't it terrible when these things happen on our watch?" And none of that was solving anything. And about 5 days later, I said to her, "So how's the patient? And I'm not talking about your grandson. I'm talking about you." And she said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Just out of curiosity," I said, "What what's this what's this tapping into for you?" And I had to wait 30, 45 seconds, maybe a minute. It certainly seemed that long. And she went, "Oh, it's funny you should ask that." She said, You're just reminding me that when I was 6 years old, my brothers and I were throwing rocks in a junkyard at rats, and my bonehead brother stuck his head up, and I grazed the side of his head with a rock, and it split it open, and he needed stitches. And she said, "Wouldn't you know it, he's never ever forgotten about that since. I mean, he's always reminded me of that." And I said, "Well, it's clear you haven't forgotten about it either." And a couple days later, she said, "I never realized how much that story with my brother was weighing on me." And it took, she didn't say this, but I think it took the occasion of the injury of her grandson to, in some ways, finally address something that had gone untouched for so long. And I want to say to every pastor, every person, every congregation, we've all got stuff like that. We've all got things in the blind spot that we don't know. We don't know if it's a bike or if it's a semi. We may know something's there, but it carries a weight, and that's why we need each other. We need to listen to one another. We need to give voice to these things, and I think our society, in some ways, is finally trying to find ways communally to give voice to a lot of pain, and that articulation is important. Sometimes the word lament, to me, theologically, is becoming a bit of a buzzword. So I prefer to say articulation. Some of this stuff needs to be voiced, and in the voicing of it, there's new space and there's new freedom for, I think, for the Spirit to begin something new. But I think it's got to get out of our hands. It's got to get out of our hearts before our hearts can be empty and our hands can be empty enough to receive what might be being offered.
I think one of the challenges that immediately leaps to mind for a pastor is we often think we've got to be on and we've got to project an image of competence and in control. So our capacity to model that probably feels pretty limited. Can I be that? You talked about the need for vulnerability. Is it safe for me to be that vulnerable in my congregation? In a previous conversation that we had, Dr. Danjuma Gibson had suggested that now's the time for pastors and congregations to invest in pastors really exploring some of their grief in intentional ways. I think he was talking even therapeutically. Um, but I suspect that there are some for whom that just feels like too big of a hurdle.
Yeah.
You had mentioned in your own journey how important clinical pastoral education, CPE, was for that. And again, maybe a pastor saying, "Oh, I can't do that. That's too far down the road." I wonder if there are intermediate steps that a pastor might undertake to start getting at this part that maybe they've been neglecting.
Well, I think so. So to me, there's four steps in let's say active mourning: accept, process, adjust, and discover. So accept the reality of the loss. Don't bear false witness about it. Be honest with yourself, and have another that you can go to, and then it's processing the emotional pain of the grief, and you don't do that overnight. That's a process. It's a process of working through and feeling it and expressing it. I think what we adjust to is the world that we have known is gone. We know that when we lose someone very dear to us, we have to adjust to a very different world than what we signed up for. No one signs up at marriage for a divorce. No one ever thinks that's going to happen to them. No one none of us ever want to bury a child. Maybe we imagine losing a parent, but when it happens, we're overwhelmed with how much pain that is. And through this process of mourning, when we do it, I think what we can discover is a new way of relating to the world that is very much informed by the grief journey, by the journey of mourning. And I think that's just really, really hard work. It's much easier for us to bypass that. And every pastor, in my view, needs to have a therapist. We need to have it. I had a therapist who was a congregant years ago, and he had a caseload of 35 people per week, and he had supervision once a week. And I said, wow, you really do that? And he said, we have 540 members of our congregation. Why in the world don't you? What's the matter with you that you're not doing this? And I had defenses around that. Well, do I really need a therapist? Well, it takes some mileage for me to, or it took some mileage for me to recognize that, oh, this is insane for me to think that I can do this on my own. And sort of to steal Yakko Hammond's good vocabulary, every pastor ought to pay someone to love them. And by that, he means get a therapist, because we cannot do it alone.
I find that so helpful. And it's a good, I mean, I hear it coming from your pastoral heart, right, in your own journey. And I think in your initial reluctance to engage that, I think a lot of pastors can see themselves. They say, hey, I don't want to go there. Maybe I don't need that. But you offer it in just this invitational way. Like who wouldn't need that, right? You compare your caseload of 540 congregants to your therapist member who had 35, and you say, what am I trying to do not tending to that?
Well, and Danjuma Gibson used the good vocabulary, or the good image of the resurrected Christ in the upper room, who's got wounds. And I think if pastors are not processing our wounds with someone, and I don't think it can be our spouse, I don't think it can be our board or our elders, I don't think it can be our partner. This needs to be done with a competent professional who knows pastors, or knows you well enough to know when you're full of it, when you're deceiving yourself, and can gently call us on that. I think pastors who don't have a place to do that are going to end up using their congregation either in their preaching or in their pastoral care interactions or in leadership capacities to sort of bleed all over them. And I think we are better suited when we preach from our scars, not from our open wounds. My open wounds are from my therapist.
That's a good word. That's a good word. I'm finding this conversation really helpful. I want to transition because, and I think you're leading us there. We know that like good grief work offers psychological benefits. But I wonder how you would articulate, how does good grief work also enrich our theology, right? Because we're not merely therapists or like pseudo-therapists in our congregations, right? We're also theologians and pastors, and there's a distinctively theological aspect to our work, and there should be. How does this grief work also enrich our theology?
Well, um, so I think I'm going to change the word a little bit. I think spirituality is how human beings make meaning out of their lives. So human beings are spiritual beings, everyone is, and every human being practices spirituality. They make meaning out of their life. And whether we acknowledge it or not, we have relationship with ourselves, relationship with God, with others, and creation. And shalom is about those things living and interacting harmoniously. And I think in a wounded, bruised, damaged, bleeding world, um, it is a human and creation function for that to need some processing and healing, and that's going to come with all of the markers of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. All of those things are going to be part of the mix, and those are very much relational things. So if I said to you, Sean, who are you? You might say a son. Well, Sean, who are you? Well, I'm a husband. Well, Sean, who are you? Well, I'm a father. I'm a neighbor. I work for PCR in the denomination. Um, all of those identity markers are tied to relationship. And so when something in us and in our relationships is broken or damaged or strained, that needs to be voiced, and it needs to be processed. And when human beings do that with each other and do that well, the relationship is enhanced. Talk to a orthopedic and you break a bone, and if you're healthy, the bone is stronger in the place of the break than any other place. Talk to couples who have gone through the mill, and those who have processed, whether that's infidelity or loss of a child or something highly stressful. And when they've done the hard work of going through that, they are stronger and more resilient. I think in some sectors of the Christian community, we have so often gone to a direction theologically of, well, God is in control, and have looked at sovereignty that way, that we have denied some of the real pain and difficulty that is part of our experience. So you read a third of the Psalms, or you read Jeremiah 20, and what happens? But Jeremiah and Moses and David and the psalmist are laying it all on the table and saying, this stinks, this is hard. Jeremiah says, you've duped me, you've overpowered me, I'm a laughing stock. And it's in getting all of that out that suddenly there's a turn, at least in that text, where his view of God completely changes, because God's got the shoulders to hear it. God's got the capacity to hear our protest and our pain that comes out of a relationship that says, if you are who you said you are, I'm asking you to act here. I'm asking you to intervene. I'm your son. I'm your daughter. I belong to you. And so for me, sovereignty is not about control. Sovereignty is about ownership. And when it's about ownership, we can say, even with COVID, even with the nightmare that's going on in this country at so many different levels, we can say, God's on the throne. We can say with the psalmist, the Lord reigns, but we can also say, where the heck are you? We are calling on our relationship with you. We trust that you are who you say you are, and we're asking you to show up. And I think we can ask it with that kind of boldness to say, we believe who you say you are. We love you, we trust you, but we're not seeing you right now. We need you to show up. And you can call that a foxhole prayer. You can call that therapy. You can call that deep Judaism or deep Christian faith. Whatever you want to call that, I think it makes a difference.
Hey, I find that such a rich answer. I'm so grateful for your time. I know our time is running short, and I wonder if there's any parting words you'd like to leave us with. Speaking to our audience, this is mostly pastors, ministry leaders. What would you want to leave them with in this time?
I think what we really need as pastors and leaders is some real honesty about how hard this is, how unsettling it is, how disorienting it is. I know some of my colleagues are wondering, where are we? Wishing we had a compass or a map for this. But I think where we need to look is we need to look at ourselves and our communities and find ways of being honest together. In my shop, there are people who are, let's get back together right now or last week. There are those who say, let's comply with the rules. And there are others who say, it's going to be a while before you see me. There are some who are deeply hurting over racial issues in our country, and there are some who are feeling immune to any of that because it doesn't touch me. I think what we all need to work on is being much more honest about the realities on the ground.
Boy, thank you so much, Dr. Nelesen, for your time and for your care for pastors across our denomination. And I hope we'll have a chance to have a conversation like this again. It's been so rich. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Goodbye.
So.